As the originator of the talented 10th, W.E.B. Du Bois was more than a leader of the early civil rights movement. Speaking on the behalf of his entire race, the Harvard Ph.D. argued that to be black in America is to live with a double consciousness, to see yourself through the eyes of a nation that has never fully accepted you, while also holding a deeper truth about who you are and what you deserve. It felt like two competing futures pulling at the same heart. For African Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that double consciousness did more than shape identity. It shaped destiny. One voice whispered that people of African descent were strangers in this new world. Stolen from Africa, they were only conditionally freed by a country that would never truly be their home. The American Colonization Society gave that whisper real form. First championed by the great compromiser himself, Henry Clay, the society argued that black citizenship was impossible. Those doubts deepened when Marcus Garvey put his money behind the Return to Africa movement. But the other voice, the second consciousness, said something very different. It found its mouthpiece in David Walker, whose appeal to the colored citizens of the world urged black men and women to realize that America is more our country than it is the whites, for we have enriched it with our blood and tears. This voice insisted that America's wealth was built on the backs of their labor, that the capital itself was built by their enslaved hands. Now free, at least in name, it urged its listeners north during the Great Migration, fueling the creative explosion of the Harlem Renaissance and the artistic expression of joy that followed. Double consciousness offered two competing visions, both born from the same history and shaped by the same trauma. But where would their success lead? To a new African American nation on the African continent? Or to life as a minority in the racially fractured United States of America? You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon divergent moments within the African American community. Episode number 3, This Land is My Land. Woody Guthrie's biggest hit, This Land is Your Land, is ironically known as America's second national anthem. Shaped by his experience as a traveling worker during the Great Depression and recorded at the height of World War II, the song carried a quiet criticism of the United States. It challenged the idea that America's capitalist system offered fair opportunity to all. Still, it painted a hopeful picture that even if this land was not yet working for everyone, one day it might. But that hope was nowhere to be found in 1816, when a group of Washington power brokers gathered around a very different idea. They believed black people should not remain in America. Strangely, this was not a Klan meeting. Some of the men in that smoke-filled room genuinely believed that returning black Americans to Africa was the best solution for everyone involved, including African Americans themselves. There were abolitionists present, men who saw slavery as a grievous sin, but who could not imagine a society where whites and free blacks lived as equals. Even more unsettling was the presence of white slaveholders. These men feared a massive slave uprising and believed the only way to defuse the ticking time bomb was to send free black people across the ocean. Abraham Lincoln was not there. At just 7 years old, he was far too young, but he would later become one of colonization's most prominent supporters, arguing it was the convenient compromise, the path that might spare the nation from choosing between abolition and white supremacy. Lincoln's political idol, Henry Clay, became the first official face of the American Colonization Society, or ACS. He described black people as a group that can never consolidate with us. Like many wealthy and powerful men of his time, Clay was a slaveholder, owning as many as 140 people. Yet he was also one of slavery's loudest critics, calling it a great evil, the darkest spot on the map of our country. His solution was to humanely send freed slaves back to Africa. But this ignored a critical reality. By 1816, most black Americans were third, fourth, or even fifth generation Americans. Barred from education, restricted in movement, and cut off from knowledge of their ancestral homelands, they knew Africa only through fragments of inherited tradition. Some cultural practices had survived, passed down through generations, but plantation slavery had intentionally mixed people from different African regions, blending languages, religions, and customs. These traditions became syncretic, new identities forged from many origins. The United States officially ended the importation of enslaved people in 1808. Long before that, slavery had already become chattel slavery, where a child inherited the status of their mother. This meant most African Americans had no living memory of Africa. Their identities were no longer rooted in Yoruba or Mandinka villages. They had been forged instead in the fields of the American South. Even if they had wanted to return, where exactly would they go? Despite what many American freshmen assume, Africa is not a country. It is a vast continent, home to hundreds of ethnic groups, thousands of languages, and millions of distinct cultural traditions. However large you imagine Africa to be, triple it. The Mercator projection, the map most commonly used in classrooms, distorts reality. It falsely enlarges Greenland and shrinks Africa in order to flatten the globe. The subconscious effect is powerful. Europe appears at the center of our world, while Africa is diminished, reduced to the size of Greenland, even though it is 14 times larger in reality. To speak of sending African Americans, quote, back to Africa was like sending an Englishman back to Europe without telling him where he belonged, whether Dublin, Warsaw, or Naples. Yet the American Colonization Society ignored this reality. It promoted colonization as though African Americans were wanderers waiting to be returned home. But their real homes were in Virginia, Baltimore, and Savannah, not in some distant homeland that no longer existed in their memory. By promoting repatriation, the ACS implied that anywhere in Africa would do, as if the entire continent were interchangeable. This erasure, this denial of identity infuriated many African Americans. In Philadelphia, Reverend Richard Allen led meetings condemning the proposal as a plan to expel us from the land of our birth. Black newspapers called it a fraud, a racist fantasy designed to solve America's race problem by removing black people rather than confronting injustice. Yet the ACS endured. It was sustained by congressional support and donations from some of the nation's most powerful men, including Francis Scott Key, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln. Some African Americans, however, expressed cautious interest. For them, colonization offered not exile, but possibility, the chance to build a black nation free from white control. This created a deep fracture within the black community, defined by two competing visions of freedom. Was liberation found by returning to an ancestral continent? Or was liberation found by claiming America, reshaping it, and insisting that a nation built by black labor must also belong in a real and tangible way to black people? The first ships left New York Harbor in 1820, carrying 90 African American men and women bound for a narrow stretch of West African coastline. The American Colonization Society had claimed this land loosely and questionably through a mix of gifts, pressure, and firepower. The settlement was named Monrovia, after ACS supporter James Monroe. That name still belongs to the capital of Liberia today. Local African tribal nations resisted the settlement from the beginning. Disease, especially malaria, devastated the newcomers, and repeated attacks on their fragile fortifications made survival even harder. The colony soon became a destination for displaced people. The United States Navy transported rescued Africans taken from illegal slave ships in the Atlantic. Expecting the colony to become self-sufficient, Washington limited its direct involvement. This left the settlement vulnerable, allowing French and British traders to encroach on its territory. Back in America, prominent African-American leader James Forten condemned the effort. He argued that colonization was a scheme to preserve slavery by removing free blacks while denying them their rightful status as American citizens. There were genuine abolitionists within the movement, but historian Nicholas Guyot explains why colonization remained deeply flawed, stating, "Two facts made this commitment supremely insidious. First, it placed the burden of ending slavery on benevolent slaveholders themselves, who would supposedly free their slaves when provided with an outlet for doing so. Second, it marked an epic endorsement of racial segregation, effectively denying the possibility of coexistence while promoting what would later be termed separate but equal." Even the capital's namesake revealed the contradiction. Despite publicly supporting colonization and serving as vice president of the Colonization Society of Virginia, Monroe never freed his own enslaved workers so that they could return to Africa. His actions exposed the gap between the movement's rhetoric and its reality. Those who chose to leave America likely expected to find acceptance in Liberia. Instead, they encountered suspicion and hostility. Indigenous Africans did not automatically embrace the newcomers, who became known as Americo-Liberians. The tension ran both ways. Settlers criticized local customs, lamenting the absence of European dining traditions. An early intellectual leader of the community, Minister Alexander Cromwell, harshly described Native Africans as a crude, underdeveloped, and benighted child. "A shadow of a man," he exclaimed. His problematic words revealed how deeply American racial and cultural hierarchies had followed the settlers across the Atlantic. The effort was troubled from the beginning. Historian Angela Tomsell notes that one of the first problems was simple. The settlers had no land. They initially landed in the British colony of Sierra Leone, but it took nearly 2 years for an American agent to secure territory further down the coast, allegedly by threatening a local leader at gunpoint. Disease and violence claimed a staggering toll. Nearly half of the original colonists died. Worse still, the colony reproduced the very inequalities it had been meant to escape. In their search for freedom, Americo-Liberians created a hierarchical society shaped by class, religion, and cultural heritage. Indigenous Africans viewed them as outsiders, with no rightful claim to rule. Yet the political power remained firmly in Americo-Liberian hands. For the Republic's first 100 years, Native Africans could not vote unless they adopted Americo-Liberian culture. The promise of liberty had survived the Atlantic crossing, but equality had not. The early struggles of Liberia's first settlers dampened enthusiasm for the colonization movement, but a series of violent events reignited interest. Nat Turner's rebellion, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, and the outbreak of the American Civil War all revived colonization as a proposed solution to America's racial tensions. The Liberian exodus gained real momentum after the premature end of Reconstruction. Beginning in South Carolina, black freedmen questioned whether coexistence with white Southerners was still possible. The Ku Klux Klan had briefly been suppressed through the efforts of Ulysses S. Grant, whose administration infiltrated the group. Combined with the enforcement acts passed by Congress, Grant's actions allowed federal authorities to prosecute supremacists and ensure fair trials. But by 1877, the 3 Reconstruction Amendments had been weakened by massive legal loopholes. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolished slavery, except as punishment for crime. Southern states exploited this exception by passing vague vagrancy laws. These laws allowed authorities to arrest black men on minor or fabricated charges. Through convict leasing, prisons then sold their labor to private employers. Chain gangs forced them to work without pay, often under brutal conditions, recreating slavery in all but name. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution overturned the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision and granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people. In theory, it guaranteed equal protection under the law, but Supreme Court decisions such as the United States v. Cruikshank and the slaughterhouse cases ruled that civil rights protection largely fell under state authority, not the federal government. This left black citizens vulnerable. As lynching spread across the South, victims and witnesses had to rely on local governments that were often unwilling or openly hostile to providing justice. Although the Civil War had toppled Confederate governments, it did little to eliminate the racial prejudice that sustained them. Even when violence was obvious and well documented, meaningful protections for freedmen were rarely enforced. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution granted black men the right to vote. In theory, this should have transformed Southern politics. The electorate was closely divided, and black voters overwhelmingly supported the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. Their votes could have reshaped political power. But once again, loopholes undermined the amendment's promise. The Supreme Court ruled that while states could not deny voting based on race, they could regulate elections. Southern states used this authority to impose poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. These measures, combined with intimidation and violence, effectively stripped black men of their voting power and allowed white Democrats to maintain control. Despite the rise of Jim Crow laws, most African Americans remained in the South. Many lacked the financial resources to leave. Others stayed because of family ties or uncertainty about opportunities elsewhere. A few, however, attempted to build new lives. The exodusters migrated west to Kansas, hoping to find independence as farmers. Another group of 200 African Americans boarded a ship called the Azore in Charleston Harbor, bound for Liberia. Their fate mirrored that of earlier settlers. 23 died during the voyage. The promised agricultural abundance proved to be illusionary. Within a year, many of the migrants were writing letters back to America, begging for money so that they could return home to the South. If the American Colonization Society offered a vision of departure, then David Walker offered a counter-vision. So fierce, so uncompromising, and so predictive, the Southern lawmakers trembled at the sight of his words. In 1829, more than a decade after the ACS was founded, Walker published a small but explosive pamphlet titled Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. It was only 24 pages long, but those pages hit like thunder. Walker was the son of an enslaved father and a free black mother. He had lived in both worlds, bondage and freedom, and saw firsthand that America was capable of denying both. By the time he settled in Boston, he had reached a searing conclusion. The problem was not the presence of black people in America. The problem was America's refusal to be the nation it claimed to be. He delivered that message with the full weight of scripture, history, and righteous rage, and it inspired millions. My favorite line from the document is his powerful declaration that America is more our country than it is the whites, for we have enriched it with our blood and tears. It is one of the most powerful sentences ever written about black belonging in the United States. In that single line, Walker flipped the entire colonization argument on its head. Why should black Americans be forced to leave a country they built? A country they continued to sustain with their labor and sacrifice. Historian Walter Johnson argues that slavery was not just part of American capitalism, but its very essence. Before the Civil War, the estimated economic value of enslaved people reached $3.6 billion, more than all the nation's railroads and factories combined. Scholars estimate that the 222 million hours of unpaid labor between 1619 and 1865 would equal more than $97 trillion today. Nowhere is this reality more visible than in Washington, D.C., where both the White House and the United States Capitol were built largely by enslaved labor. Walker's logic was devastatingly clear. Black men and women had tilled America's soil for 2 centuries. As earlier episodes in this series have shown, they sparked the Revolution, fought in its armies, and endured unspeakable cruelty. To suggest that they should leave, to abandon the only home that they had ever known, was in Walker's view hypocrisy of the highest order. The appeal was so incendiary, the southern states banned it on sight. Georgia authorized the death penalty for anyone caught distributing it, and North Carolina placed a bounty on Walker's head. But despite these efforts, the pamphlet spread widely. Historian Kenyon Gradert explains that the appeal was a tame title for the prophecy smoldering between its covers. Authorities feared its message, especially its calls for resistance. Walker wrote that it is no more harm for you to kill a man who is trying to kill you than it is for you to take a drink of water when thirsty. He warned that enslaved people were denied education because knowledge would reveal their right to resist. And he delivered a final thunderous warning. Unless you speedily alter your course, you and your country are gone, for God Almighty will tear up the very face of the earth. 8 exclamation points punctuated that warning, each one a signal of urgency and fury. Years later, Frederick Douglass would carry Walker's message forward. He embraced the same central truth. African Americans had a claim to the United States that no white supremacist could deny. Black people were not guests, they were founders. Their blood had paid the nation's mortgage. Through his partnership with William Lloyd Garrison, Douglass became one of the nation's leading abolitionists. A formerly enslaved man, he had escaped bondage and rose to captivate audiences of thousands. During the Civil War, he became one of Abraham Lincoln's most important unofficial advisors. Their bond was genuine. At Lincoln's funeral, Mary Todd Lincoln told Douglass that he may have been the president's only true friend. But before the Civil War, Douglass faced a painful choice. After the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, he was forced to flee to England to avoid capture. From across the Atlantic, he continued his intellectual assault on slavery. But he was separated from his family, who remained in America. A group of British women offered to purchase his freedom. Douglass was overjoyed, but Garrison objected, arguing that paying for freedom meant recognizing slavery as legitimate. Douglass ultimately accepted the offer, and the disagreement fractured their partnership. Now legally free, Douglass returned to America to continue the fight. That word matters. Returned. He did not remain in Britain. He did not abandon America. He came back determined to force the nation to live up to its ideals. Walker and Douglas shared a belief that could not coexist with the American Colonization Society. Where the ACS preached departure, they preached possession. Where the ACS promised escape, they demanded transformation. Where the ACS saw outsiders, they saw rightful heirs. They established a new vision, one that fueled the abolitionist movement, resurfaced during the Great Migration, and flowered in the Harlem Renaissance. A vision that declared with absolute clarity, we are not leaving, we are America. Between 1916 and 1970, roughly 6 million African Americans left the rural South in what historians refer to as the Great Migration. It remains one of the largest internal migrations in world history. Northern industrialists, flush with cash from World War I, recruited African Americans for well-paying factory jobs. The Chicago Defender, the nation's leading black newspaper, distributed migration guides urging Southern blacks to move north for higher wages and a chance to live as men. Living beneath the brutality of Jim Crow, it might seem logical that white Southerners were glad to see them go. But segregation was never just about exclusion, it was about control. Emmett Till wasn't murdered in Mississippi simply for being black. He was lynched for the perceived offense of whistling at a white woman. In the Jim Crow South, black people were tolerated only if they remained deferential, invisible, and exploitable. Terrified at losing their cheap labor force, Southern governments passed laws to stop black workers from leaving, outlawing travel north, and even lynching those suspected of trying. Yet millions still risked everything, boarding trains bound for northern industrial cities. They were promised opportunity. They found barriers. The best-paying jobs went to white workers, while black migrants were pushed into the lowest ranks of factory life. The North was not a promised land. It offered a different kind of racism, redlining, white flight, and ghettoization. Richard Wright, who left Mississippi for Chicago in 1927 at age 19, immortalized this migration in his 1941 work, 12 Million Black Voices. Historians consider it the definitive sociological and literary portrait of the Great Migration. Wright describes black Southerners fleeing the plantation feudalism of Dixie and stepping into a futurescape of hard pavements and harsh northern winds. He captured their emotional reality with haunting precision. We are the children of the world's most tragic migration, he wrote. Yet we bear a hope that will not die. But these migrants poured into cities unprepared to receive them. Housing covenants in Chicago, Detroit, and New York City confined them to overcrowded neighborhoods. Tensions erupted into violence. The East St. Louis massacre, the Chicago race riot, and the destruction of Tulsa's Black Wall Street in 1921. It was into this volatile, traumatized, yet hopeful world that Marcus Garvey stepped. Garvey arrived in Harlem in 1916 from his home nation of Jamaica. 2 years earlier, he had founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA. By 1919, he stood at the center of the Harlem Renaissance, an explosion of black cultural pride. Black poets, painters, and performers crossed racial barriers and established themselves as elites in their fields. Yet progress remained incomplete. At the Cotton Club, black musicians like Louis Armstrong performed for segregated white audiences. Those audiences celebrated their music, a stark contrast to the white crowds who had applauded minstrel shows just a generation earlier. Meanwhile, countless working-class black families crowded into Harlem tenements. Garvey saw them not as refugees, but as citizens of a nation waiting to be born. His message was simple and profound. A people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. His solution, however, looked backward. Return to Africa, rebuild a black empire, and defy the West. This was colonization reimagined, no longer led by white slaveholders, but by black leadership itself. Between 1919 and 1922, as many as 6 million people joined the UNIA, making it the largest mass movement of black people in Western history. With offices in 38 states and influence stretching across the Caribbean, Canada, Central America, Brazil, and West Africa, the movement spanned the globe. Garvey's newspaper, The Negro World, spread messages of Pan-Africanism, black pride, and economic self-sufficiency. This was not simply protest. Garvey was building a nation in exile. His most ambitious project was the Black Star Line, a black-owned steamship corporation designed to connect the African diaspora and enable their return. Funded largely by working-class black investors, the company raised $500,000 and purchased 3 ships, one renamed in honor of Frederick Douglass. But $500,000 did not stretch far. One ship leaked constantly, another suffered a boiler explosion and caught fire, and the third sank under suspicious circumstances. Mismanagement played a role. Garvey himself often insisted ships stop wherever politically useful, even if cargo spoiled. But external forces also contributed. White ship brokers exploited the UNIA's inexperience. Port officials obstructed routes. Insurance companies refused coverage. Still, the symbolism of the Black Star Line cannot be overstated. For the first time in Atlantic history, black people owned a fleet of ships, the very vessels that had once carried their ancestors into slavery. The Ku Klux Klan did not target all black Americans. It targeted those who spoke up, succeeded, or inspired hope. J. Edgar Hoover, the newly appointed head of the early Federal Bureau of Investigation, grew deeply suspicious of the rising influence of Marcus Garvey, a black immigrant commanding global attention. Hoover created a special criminal category he called Negro subversion. Garvey's name sat at the top of the list. Hoover himself labeled him the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America. In the years that followed, Hoover made it clear that he intended to destroy Garvey by any means necessary. James Wormley Jones was hired as the FBI's first black agent, specifically to infiltrate the Universal Negro Improvement Association. His mission was to uncover socialist or subversive ties that could be exploited during the first Red Scare. But Jones found no evidence of treason or sedition. Unable to prove ideological subversion, federal investigators shifted strategy. They charged Garvey with mail fraud, claiming he sold stock in the Black Star Line before fully securing one of its ships. Garvey had, in fact, purchased ships and operated them, however unsuccessfully. The charges rested on technicalities, not outright deception. Most modern historians agree the case was legally weak, but politically effective. Garvey was convicted in 1923 and sentenced to 5 years in the Atlanta Federal Jail, the maximum allowed. His sentence was later commuted by President Calvin Coolidge on the condition that Garvey deport himself back to Jamaica. With his self-deportation, the Black Star Line collapsed. The UNIA fractured. The dream of mass return to Africa faded once again. But Garvey's ideas survived him. Garveyism influenced West African nationalist movements, the rise of Rastafarianism, the Nation of Islam, and even Malcolm X, whose parents had been devoted followers. A seed had been planted, but once again the dream of physical return to Africa failed to take root. Instead, Garveyism evolved into black nationalism, a parallel force within the cultural explosion of the Harlem Renaissance. This movement was not rooted in exodus, but in transformation. Between 1920 and 1935, Harlem became the unofficial capital of Black America. Its population surged from 50,000 to 200,000. Rather than rejecting America, Renaissance artists asserted their central place within it. Garvey saw Harlem and concluded the solution was departure. Harlem itself reached the opposite conclusion. The solution was transformation. This was yet another stirring example of W.E.B. Du Bois' double consciousness, the sense of two souls, two identities, and two competing futures within a single Black American life. For generations, African Americans lived between two worlds, a stolen past rooted in Africa and a present nation that denied them full humanity. Colonizationists argued these worlds could never be reconciled. They claimed Black Americans were strangers in the nation they built. They insisted a multiracial democracy grounded in liberty and equality was impossible. But David Walker rejected that claim with righteous fury. He elevated Black Americans as co-founders of the nation, its builders, its laborers, and its uncredited architects. His appeal became the first great declaration that double consciousness could be resolved, not by leaving America, but by claiming it. The Harlem Renaissance carried that message forward, in the trumpet of Louis Armstrong, in the poetry of Langston Hughes, and in the folklore of Zora Neale Hurston. Black artists forged a new American identity, one that embraced its African roots while claiming its rightful place at the center of American life. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.